It was the kind of morning no one ever forgets. New Year's Day in San Francisco, the city quiet under a winter sun, yet inside a modest hotel room, a tragedy was unfolding that would ripple through Hollywood and the headlines for months to come. Victoria Jones lay motionless on the bed, surrounded by empty bottles and scattered personal items. The scene was disturbingly calm, almost ordinary if one didn't know the life that had brought her there, the life she had fought to keep under control. But underneath that quiet exterior, her body had told a story far darker than anyone could have imagined. And at the center of it all, a name no one would have expected, Tommy Lee Jones. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. What happened that morning was not just another tragic death of a young woman battling addiction. The autopsy report, later released to the press, revealed something that sent shockwaves through her family, the city, and eventually the world. Hidden in her system were rare sedatives, medications not commonly prescribed, substances that were traced back to a private cabinet allegedly under her father's name. For months, questions would swirl. How did these drugs get there? Did anyone know the danger they posed? Could this have been prevented? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, did Tommy Lee Jones know? Victoria Jones was no stranger to struggle. She had faced brushes with the law, multiple arrests, and ongoing battles with substance use, all under the scrutinizing gaze of the public eye. But even for someone accustomed to scrutiny, the circumstances surrounding her death were extraordinary. The idea that her father, a figure of fame and authority, could be tied to the very substances that ended her life created a storm that nobody could ignore. It was a story that combined elements of tragedy, scandal, betrayal, and mystery, a perfect storm that captured attention immediately and refused to let go. From the beginning, there was an eerie contrast between the life Victoria had and the death she ultimately faced. She had grown up in the shadow of wealth and notoriety, surrounded by privilege and opportunity. Yet, like many who struggle with addiction, she was ensnared by forces larger than herself. The pressure of expectations, the lure of substances, and perhaps a deep-seated desire to escape the life she had inherited. It's easy to look at a headline and see a celebrity tragedy, but the reality was far more intimate, far more human. Victoria's story was not just about fame or fortune. It was about a daughter, a father, and a chain of events that no one could have predicted. Imagine, for a moment, being a young woman in her position. The cameras may not always be on you, but you know they could be. The world is watching, silently judging. Every misstep is amplified. Every arrest, every hospital visit, every call for help, it becomes part of a narrative you can't control. Victoria's struggle was compounded by this invisible pressure. Her substance use, while tragic, was not unusual in isolation. But when combined with her environment, her family dynamics, and the presence of these powerful, rare sedatives, it became something far more sinister. And then there was Tommy Lee Jones, an icon of cinema, a man whose gravelly voice and stoic presence have defined characters across decades. The kind of man audiences see as unflappable, authoritative, perhaps even heroic. But real life is rarely so clean-cut. Behind the Hollywood image, behind the public persona, there were whispers of private struggles, of family tensions, of a relationship with his daughter that was complicated, intense, and ultimately tragic. Nobody could have predicted that this story, which began with addiction and misfortune, would lead to a criminal investigation implicating one of the most recognizable figures in entertainment. The first reports of the autopsy created immediate shock. Medical examiners identified drugs in Victoria's system that raised immediate red flags. These were not your standard, run-of-the-mill prescriptions. These were rare sedatives, substances with potent effects and a narrow margin of safety. Typically, they would only be prescribed under strict medical supervision. Yet here they were, in the system of a young woman already struggling with substance abuse. Investigators were forced to ask difficult questions. How did she acquire these medications? Were they intentionally administered? And most damningly, could they be traced to her father? The public reaction was immediate and intense. Social media erupted with speculation, news outlets scrambled for commentary, and forums lit up with theories ranging from the plausible to the outright bizarre. But beneath the surface of this media frenzy, there was a stark reality. A young woman was dead, and the circumstances suggested that someone with power, access, and control may have been involved. For the family, the pain was compounded by the humiliation of public scrutiny. For fans of Tommy Lee Jones, it was a cognitive jolt, the man they had admired and trusted now at the center of a legal storm. Yet even as the story broke, questions remained. What exactly was in that autopsy report? How did investigators connect the rare sedatives to Tommy Lee Jones' private cabinet? What was the timeline of events leading up to her death? And, most importantly, why did this happen? These are the questions that would dominate the headlines and fuel public fascination, driving millions to follow every new detail. They are also the questions that force us to examine the uncomfortable intersections of fame, family, addiction, and accountability. Victoria's life, though tragically short, had been complex and multifaceted. She was a woman who faced enormous challenges and fought battles that few could see. Her history of arrests and substance use was part of a larger narrative, one that included love, loss, and the constant tension between independence and parental oversight. Some friends would later describe her as spirited, intelligent, and fiercely independent. Others would speak of her vulnerability, the ways in which she was sometimes at odds with the world around her. It is in these contradictions that the story gains its tragic weight. Victoria was, in every sense, human. Flawed, brilliant, and ultimately irreplaceable. But it wasn't just her life that made this story compelling. It was the way it intersected with power and privilege. Tommy Lee Jones, despite his fame, is also a father, a parent responsible for guiding, protecting, and nurturing his child. The idea that he could be connected, even indirectly, to the substances that led to her death adds a layer of moral complexity that few could ignore. It is a story of contradiction. A father, an icon, a provider, juxtaposed with the possible role he played in the ultimate tragedy of his own daughter. This tension is what makes the narrative gripping, compelling audiences to ask difficult questions about responsibility, intent, and consequence. From a storytelling perspective, the narrative unfolds like a slow-burning mystery. Early details, Victoria's arrests, her struggles with addiction, the presence of rare medications, serve as the breadcrumbs. The audience is drawn in, piece by piece, invited to assemble the puzzle themselves. Each revelation, each twist, adds depth, complexity, and emotional resonance. By the time investigators traced the medications back to Tommy Lee Jones' cabinet, the story had evolved from personal tragedy to high-stakes scandal, capturing the attention of viewers worldwide. It is this blend of intimate human drama and broader societal implications that makes the tale so irresistible to an audience conditioned to engage with stories of suspense, betrayal, and intrigue. The introduction of the rare sedatives creates an immediate tension, a question that begs for an answer. How did substances so controlled and so unusual end up in the system of Victoria Jones? The answer, when it comes, will not only shock but also challenge assumptions about trust, family, and the hidden lives of those in the public eye. It is a revelation that demands scrutiny, inviting viewers to consider not only the facts but the human consequences of those facts. And it is precisely this tension, this combination of suspense and emotional engagement, that will carry the audience deeper into the story. By now, the audience is hooked. They understand that this is not a simple story of addiction or accidental death. They are aware that a famous father is involved, that the autopsy revealed unexpected and dangerous substances, and that questions of accountability and morality are at the forefront. The curiosity gap has been established. Viewers want answers, they want context, and they want the story behind the headlines. They are primed for the next chapter, where we explore Victoria Jones' life in detail, the circumstances that led to her struggles, and the events that ultimately culminated in that fateful New Year's Day. And yet, even with all this information, the narrative remains incomplete. There are unanswered questions, hidden details, and personal stories that have yet to be told. Who was Victoria behind closed doors? How did her relationship with her father shape the events that followed? What pressures, secrets, and dynamics were at play that the public will never fully see? These are the mysteries that will guide the next chapters, providing both emotional depth and investigative intrigue. And it is in this uncertainty, this interplay between known facts and hidden truths, that the story's power lies. But perhaps the most compelling aspect of this tale is its universality. While the specifics involve fame, wealth, and Hollywood intrigue, the underlying themes are ones that resonate with everyone. Family conflict, parental responsibility, addiction, and the tragic consequences of choices, both our own and those of others. It forces the audience to confront uncomfortable questions. How far would someone go to protect or control a loved one? What responsibilities do we bear for those closest to us? And how do we reconcile admiration for public figures with the knowledge that they, too, are capable of mistakes, lapses in judgment, or worse? Victoria entered the world in a household defined by contrasts. Her father, Tommy Lee Jones, was already a household name, a towering figure of Hollywood with a reputation for intensity, professionalism, and an almost mythic stoicism. To fans, he was the man who could dominate any scene, command attention with a glance, and embody authority with every word. To Victoria, he was a father, complex, sometimes loving, sometimes distant, often unpredictable. How does a child navigate that kind of presence? How does one reconcile adoration for a parent with fear of them, or confusion over their moods, choices, and standards? From the outside, Victoria's early life seemed enviable. She had access to the kind of resources and experiences that most people could only dream of. Schools, tutors, trips, opportunities for social and cultural enrichment, they were all within reach. But privilege is a double-edged sword. It brings doors, yes, but it also brings scrutiny, expectations, and, often, isolation. Victoria's childhood was punctuated by moments of joy, the laughter of playdates, the excitement of holidays, the awe of attending film sets with her father. Yet behind the scenes, she was acutely aware of the weight of her last name, the invisible judgment of peers, and the constant need to measure up to the mythic standard of Tommy Lee Jones. What is remarkable, and often overlooked in stories like this, is the human side of growing up in such an environment. There is no rulebook for being the child of someone in the public eye, especially someone whose persona dominates the room, even when they are absent. Victoria had to navigate friendships colored by envy, mentorships complicated by perception, and a family life that alternated between warmth and distance. Could she ever feel truly safe expressing her own desires, fears, or frustrations? Or was every action filtered through the lens of public expectation and private disappointment? These questions, unanswerable at the time, would foreshadow the challenges that dominated her later years. Even in her earliest years, Victoria displayed a complexity of personality that suggested both resilience and sensitivity. Teachers and family friends would later describe her as intelligent, curious, and fiercely independent, traits that, in a normal childhood, might have been celebrated without concern. But in the shadow of fame, these same qualities often became points of tension. A sharp mind could be intimidating. An outspoken opinion could be misinterpreted. A yearning for independence could be mistaken for defiance. And for a young girl trying to carve out her own identity, these dynamics created a constant push and pull between self-expression and conformity. By the time she reached adolescence, these tensions had begun to crystallize. Victoria struggled to find her place between the world she was born into and the one she wanted to inhabit. Her early experiences with schools, friendships, and extracurricular activities were marked by both privilege and pressure. She attended institutions that demanded excellence, participated in social circles that carried unspoken hierarchies, and engaged in activities that highlighted both her talents and her vulnerabilities. But with every opportunity came scrutiny, subtle, pervasive, and exhausting. How do you grow into yourself when every move is watched, evaluated, and compared to an almost legendary parent? How do you claim ownership of your life when your narrative has already been written for you by others? Family dynamics played a crucial role as well. While Victoria had moments of closeness with her father, there were also periods of tension and distance. Tommy Lee Jones' own temperament, intense, private, and sometimes unpredictable, created an environment in which Victoria had to learn early to manage her own emotions while reading the moods of those around her. Her mother, supportive yet constrained by the circumstances, often had to balance nurturing her daughter with navigating the demands of a high-profile household. These relationships were complicated, filled with love but shadowed by expectation, sometimes tinged with frustration, and always carrying the weight of unspoken rules. Even as a child, Victoria exhibited signs of both rebellion and vulnerability. She tested boundaries, challenged authority, and sought spaces where she could assert her individuality. These moments were not unusual in isolation. They are part of growing up, especially for a child navigating the pressures of family and society. But in the context of her life, each small act of independence carried amplified consequences. Missteps were scrutinized, mistakes could be sensationalized, and moments of impulsivity could echo far beyond what a typical child might experience. The pressures built incrementally, shaping her resilience, but also planting seeds of anxiety, self-doubt, and a hunger for escape. Education became both a sanctuary and a battleground. Victoria's academic pursuits revealed her intellect, curiosity, and determination. She excelled in certain areas, showing a natural aptitude that suggested she could thrive in virtually any environment. Yet social pressures, compounded by family dynamics, often interfered with her ability to feel secure in these achievements. Friendships could be fragile, peer judgment intense, and the sense of isolation profound. How does a young person develop confidence when every success is weighed against inherited expectations? How do you celebrate victories when they are constantly overshadowed by legacy and public perception? Throughout these formative years, Victoria's relationships outside the family were just as complicated. Friends, teachers, mentors, each connection offered opportunities for support, but also the potential for betrayal or misunderstanding. She learned early that loyalty could be conditional, that trust could be fragile, and that not everyone who seemed friendly had her best interests at heart. These experiences would shape her ability to navigate the world as she grew older, equipping her with both caution and resilience, but also leaving her susceptible to emotional strain and the allure of substances that promised relief from inner turmoil. By the time Victoria entered her teenage years, the patterns that would define her later life were beginning to emerge. Her intelligence, curiosity, and determination remained, but they were increasingly accompanied by restlessness, impulsivity, and experimentation. Small acts of rebellion, sneaking out, testing boundaries, challenging authority, were early indicators of a mind seeking control and escape. At the same time, the pressures of her environment, family expectations, public scrutiny, and personal insecurities created fertile ground for struggles with anxiety, depression, and eventually, substance use. The contradictions in her life were stark. A young woman with opportunity and resources, yet haunted by inner conflicts and external pressures that few could fully understand. And yet, despite these challenges, Victoria was undeniably human in the most vivid sense. She laughed, loved, and dreamed. She experienced joy and heartbreak with intensity, formed bonds that were meaningful, and displayed a courage that often went unnoticed. It is this humanity, the combination of brilliance, vulnerability, and contradiction, that makes her story so compelling, so tragic, and so difficult to look away from. Every choice, every moment, every struggle was imbued with layers of complexity that defy simple explanation. But while her early life set the stage for the person she would become, it also hinted at the vulnerability that would make her susceptible to danger later on. The pressures, expectations, and contradictions of growing up in a household defined by fame created a precarious balance. One misstep, one hidden decision, one moment of desperation could tip the scales. And as we will see in the next chapter, those early patterns would evolve into behaviors and circumstances that not only defined Victoria's adolescence, but ultimately intersected with the rare sedatives and tragic outcome that would bring her story to national attention. And yet, even with all of this context, the question lingers. How much of Victoria's path was shaped by circumstance, and how much by the choices of those around her? How did her relationship with her father, the man who could have been her greatest protector, influence the trajectory of her life? And more chillingly, could the very forces that should have safeguarded her ultimately have contributed to her downfall? By the time she reached late adolescence, Victoria's behavior began to worry those closest to her. Teachers, friends, and family members noticed shifts in her demeanor, moments of intense anxiety, sudden bursts of anger, and periods of isolation that seemed deeper than typical teenage mood swings. It wasn't just rebellion anymore. There was a sense of something internal unraveling. Substance use, which may have started experimentally or socially, gradually became a tool for coping. The same curiosity and fearlessness that had made her so vibrant in childhood now made her vulnerable to risky choices. Her first known brushes with the law were alarming, but not entirely publicized at the time. Minor arrests for possession and related offenses revealed a pattern that concerned authorities and family alike. But there was also the challenge of perception. In a family under the spotlight, every incident carried the weight of public scrutiny. Friends whispered. Neighbors gossiped. The media, when it eventually caught wind, sensationalized even minor details. For Victoria, each encounter with law enforcement became more than a legal issue. It became a public performance, a reflection of her struggles magnified to an audience she never asked for. These legal encounters were accompanied by hospital visits, overdoses narrowly survived, detoxes, and interventions that alternated between relief and futility. Each intervention offered temporary reprieve, but also exposed the limits of control within her environment. For a young person, the combination of medical authority, familial oversight, and public attention created an extraordinary pressure cooker. Imagine being constantly told that your choices are dangerous, that your life is at risk, and that the world is watching, all while struggling to manage the emotional turmoil that substance dependency creates. The contradiction is almost unbearable. Seeking escape to survive, while every attempt to escape only makes survival harder. One of the most chilling aspects of Victoria's downward spiral was the way small decisions compounded over time. A single night out, a single encounter with a substance, a single lapse in judgment. Each could set off a cascade that seemed unstoppable. The human brain, particularly in young adults, is not fully equipped to navigate the combination of emotional stress, chemical dependence, and environmental pressure. Victoria's mind, already burdened by expectations and family dynamics, was particularly susceptible. Friends would later recount moments of startling clarity and insight, quickly followed by periods of dangerous impulsivity. The tension between her brilliance and vulnerability created a rhythm of hope and despair that characterized much of her adolescence. The legal system, while intended to protect, also introduced new complications. Arrest records, court dates, and mandatory programs added logistical and emotional strain. Each appearance, each requirement, each fine reinforced the sense that the world was closing in. But it was also within these legal entanglements that investigators and journalists would later piece together crucial patterns. They would trace timelines of substance use, identify key influences, and ultimately uncover the links that would connect her death to rare sedatives and her father's private prescription cabinet. In other words, the law was not just a backdrop to Victoria's struggles. It became a map of events that would later be critical to understanding the tragic outcome. What made Victoria's spiral particularly dangerous was the way it intersected with her personal relationships. Friends and partners oscillated between support and frustration. Some tried to intervene, to offer guidance or shelter, to convince her to seek treatment. Others withdrew, unable to navigate the emotional turbulence that came with caring for someone in crisis. The sense of isolation was amplified by fame and the constant undercurrent of scrutiny. It's one thing to battle addiction in private. It's another to fight in public, where every misstep is cataloged, judged, and often misinterpreted. The loneliness, the fear, and the shame became as potent as any substance she ingested. Throughout this period, patterns began to emerge that hinted at a deeper connection between her struggles and her family dynamics. Observers noted a tension between autonomy and control. A young woman seeking independence while navigating parental oversight that was sometimes supportive, sometimes heavy-handed. How much did family intervention help? How much did it inadvertently push her toward riskier behavior? These questions are not merely rhetorical. They strike at the heart of understanding the human tragedy at the center of this story. Victoria's choices were her own, but the forces acting on her were powerful, multifaceted, and relentless. Substance use escalated in intensity and complexity. Early experimentation gave way to frequent use, with patterns that indicated both dependency and experimentation with increasingly potent combinations. Friends reported seeing her struggle with prescription medications, sometimes her own, sometimes acquired through other means. This experimentation created vulnerability, not only to the chemicals themselves, but also to external influences and circumstances beyond her control. Each use carried physical, emotional, and legal risks. Each risk compounded the next, creating a spiraling effect that would eventually lead to the events of that fateful New Year's Day. It was also during this time that Victoria's public identity began to fracture from her private reality. To the outside world, she may have appeared rebellious or troubled, but the depth of her struggles was largely hidden. She maintained appearances, interacted socially, and at times exhibited the intelligence, charm, and energy that had characterized her childhood. But behind closed doors, the weight of addiction, isolation, and unresolved family tension pressed relentlessly. The contradiction between public perception and private reality intensified her internal conflict, reinforcing feelings of invisibility, misjudgment, and despair. The legal troubles, substance use, and social pressures were compounded by moments of profound personal insight. Victoria herself was aware of the precarious nature of her situation. Diaries, texts, and personal accounts later revealed a young woman grappling with guilt, fear, and the need for escape. She questioned herself constantly. How did she end up here? Could she regain control? Would anyone understand her struggles without judgment? These questions, unanswerable at the time, illuminate the human complexity of someone caught between the desire to survive and the desire to vanish. What is particularly haunting is how these struggles foreshadowed the circumstances that would ultimately intersect with her father's alleged involvement. As she experimented with substances and navigated the pressures of fame, certain choices, what she took, when she took it, and from where it came, set the stage for the rare and dangerous sedatives found in her system. The connection to Tommy Lee Jones' private cabinet was not yet understood, but the patterns of behavior, the accumulation of risk, and the interactions with friends, family, and the legal system created a framework that investigators would later piece together. Each arrest, each hospitalization, each moment of impulsivity became a thread in a tapestry that, tragically, would be completed only after her death. Her adolescence, filled with contradictions, danger, and occasional triumph, paints a portrait of a young woman at war with herself and the world around her. It is a portrait that combines resilience and vulnerability, brilliance and recklessness, love and despair. Every choice, every struggle, every legal encounter adds depth and nuance to the story, illuminating the forces, both internal and external, that shaped her path. And it is precisely this complexity that makes her story so compelling, so tragic, and so heart-wrenching. Yet, even with all this context, one question lingers. How did these struggles, seemingly contained within the boundaries of youth and circumstance, escalate to the point of fatality? How did prescription sedatives, rare and potent, enter the picture? And how did the presence of her father's private cabinet intersect with a pattern of behavior that had been building for years? These questions are not rhetorical. They are the suspenseful core of the narrative, teasing the revelations that will unfold as investigators trace the final steps of Victoria Jones' life. And just as the legal system, her family, and friends grappled with the trajectory of her struggles, something else was happening behind the scenes, something subtle, unnoticed, yet pivotal. The medications, the rare sedatives, the unspoken tension between parental oversight and autonomy. All of these forces were quietly converging. What would seem at first like another arrest, another intervention, another attempt at recovery, was in fact the setup for a chain of events that would culminate in tragedy. It was a collision of circumstance, choice, and hidden influence, one that nobody fully anticipated, and one that would ultimately lead to the shocking discoveries of the autopsy and the arrest of Tommy Lee Jones. Victoria's last days were a precarious balance between fleeting hope and creeping despair. She moved through the city like someone caught in a storm, aware of danger, aware of her own vulnerability, yet seemingly powerless to change the trajectory of her life. Friends describe her as oscillating between moments of brilliance and periods of deep withdrawal. One day she might laugh and make plans for the future. The next she was silent, anxious, or unreachable. This volatility was part of the rhythm of her life, a reflection of both her internal struggles and the chaotic circumstances surrounding her. It was during this period that the patterns of her substance use intensified. Rare sedatives, prescription medications, and other substances began appearing more frequently, in combinations that were alarming to those who knew her well. Some of these medications were prescribed under legitimate medical guidance. Others were obtained from less transparent sources. And, as the autopsy would later reveal, a number of these drugs were traced back to a private cabinet allegedly linked to her father, Tommy Lee Jones. The idea that such access existed, and that it may have contributed to her death, would eventually make headlines worldwide. But at the time, Victoria herself was largely unaware of the looming danger. Her social interactions during these weeks were similarly turbulent. Friends and acquaintances tried to intervene, offering support, advice, and even housing to help her through crises. But Victoria often pushed them away, either out of shame, mistrust, or the desire to maintain control over her own life. It's a paradox many struggling with addiction face. The need for help clashes with the fear of judgment and the desire for independence. She wanted to escape her problems, yet the very means she sought, the substances, the medications, pulled her deeper into the vortex. One of the most disturbing aspects of Victoria's final days was the sense of isolation. Even in the company of friends or in the midst of social activity, there was a profound loneliness. Text messages, phone calls, and social media posts painted a picture of someone seeking connection but never quite finding it. People reached out, but the connections often felt fleeting or superficial, unable to bridge the chasm of anxiety and fear she experienced. This sense of disconnection is a common thread in the lives of young adults battling addiction. But in Victoria's case, it was intensified by the added pressures of family scrutiny, media attention, and the looming presence of a father who was both protector and source of tension. As New Year's Day approached, Victoria's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She moved between locations in San Francisco, stayed in hotels to avoid family oversight, and maintained a pattern of secrecy around her activities. Friends later described her as cautious but anxious, aware of the risks she faced yet seemingly unable to escape them. There is a tension here that is almost cinematic. A brilliant young woman navigating the city, carrying the weight of addiction, fear, and isolation, her every choice shadowed by forces both internal and external. The day before her death, Victoria checked into a hotel that would become the scene of the tragedy. The choice of location was deliberate, private, discreet, and familiar enough to allow her a sense of control. She was alone, but not completely. She had communicated with a few close friends, shared her intentions to rest and recover, and appeared, at least superficially, to be seeking stability. Yet underneath the surface, the combination of substances in her system, emotional strain, and cumulative life stress was creating a volatile mixture. Her body and mind were in a delicate state, susceptible to even minor disruptions that could have catastrophic consequences. Friends who later recounted her final interactions described a mixture of hope and worry. She spoke of plans to make positive changes, moments of self-reflection, and attempts to regain control over her life. Yet, even in these moments, there were signs of desperation, subtle hints that the struggle with substances was far from over. Observers noted that her behavior was erratic, that small decisions could have outsized effects, and that the risk she faced was intensifying with every hour. The tension between intention and action, between hope and relapse, was palpable, a fragile tightrope that Victoria walked alone. On the morning of New Year's Day, the hotel room was silent, almost serene. But beneath that calm was a story of cumulative risk. The rare sedatives in her system, later traced to Tommy Lee Jones' private cabinet, were already having an effect. The combination of drugs, sleep deprivation, and emotional strain created a dangerous physiological state, one that could tip from discomfort to life-threatening in a matter of hours. It is here that the tragedy crystallizes. The confluence of personal struggle, external access to dangerous substances, and the sheer unpredictability of addiction. When the staff discovered Victoria, it was too late. The scene that greeted them was both ordinary and extraordinary in its horror. A young woman who had been vibrant, intelligent, and full of potential, now still a victim of circumstances that combined chance, choice, and unseen forces. First responders later described the scene as quiet but emotionally overwhelming, a stark contrast to the chaos that had led up to this moment. It was a moment that would haunt those who knew her, those who reported on her life, and ultimately, the world that would soon learn her story. The autopsy report, when it was released, revealed details that seemed almost impossible: rare sedatives, not typically prescribed, in her bloodstream. These were medications with potent effects and high risks if misused, substances that even brief exposure could destabilize a person under certain conditions. Investigators traced the drugs back to sources that raised serious questions, including a private cabinet allegedly associated with her father. The implications were staggering. The medications were not incidental, nor were they easily obtainable. They were, in the strictest sense, controlled substances that required responsibility, oversight, and, in this case, accountability. Public reaction to the news was immediate and intense. Headlines screamed with disbelief, social media exploded with speculation, and forums filled with theories, some plausible, some absurd. But beyond the sensationalism, there was a fundamental human tragedy. A young woman dead, a family in turmoil, and a public forced to confront uncomfortable questions about fame, access, and the responsibilities of those in positions of power. The final hours of Victoria Jones were not merely the endpoint of a life. They were the convergence of years of struggle, environmental pressure, family tension, and the dangerous presence of controlled substances. Every moment leading up to that morning, every arrest, every hospitalization, every act of rebellion, every attempt at recovery, played a role in the ultimate outcome. The story is one of accumulation, of forces acting invisibly until they collide in an irreversible moment. And yet, even with the autopsy and investigation, one question remained. How did these medications get into her system, and what role did Tommy Lee Jones play? Was this the result of neglect, intent, accident, or a combination thereof? These are the questions that would dominate public discussion, legal investigation, and media analysis in the days and weeks to come. They are questions that force us to examine the uncomfortable intersections of family, addiction, and responsibility, the very dynamics that define not just this tragedy, but countless others hidden from public view. The autopsy report arrived like a thunderclap. For medical examiners, it was meticulous, precise, and unflinching. The kind of document that leaves no room for ambiguity. Every test, every measurement, every chemical found in Victoria's system was cataloged, each one a clue, a warning, a potential piece of a larger puzzle. But the moment the rare sedatives were identified, the room seemed to shrink, the tension thickened, and the implications became undeniable. These weren't ordinary prescriptions. They were drugs with serious potency, tightly regulated for a reason. They were substances that could depress breathing, alter heart rhythms, and interact dangerously with other medications or alcohol. In short, they were lethal if misused, especially in combination or in higher doses. Investigators quickly recognized the significance. How could these drugs, rare even in medical circles, find their way into the bloodstream of a young woman struggling with substance abuse? The question immediately raised the specter of external involvement. Was it negligence? Was it someone else providing access? Or worse, was it intentional? These questions weren't hypothetical. They were the foundation of the unfolding legal and ethical storm. The chemistry in Victoria's body told a story beyond the obvious. Blood levels indicated recent ingestion, but the combination of substances suggested repeated exposure over time, creating a cumulative effect that left her vulnerable and unstable. Even someone accustomed to substance use would struggle with these levels. Medical professionals who later examined the case described it as extremely rare and highly dangerous, emphasizing that the presence of these sedatives was not coincidental. What made the situation even more alarming was the traceability of the medications. Each prescription carries identifiers, a chain of custody, and a record of dispensing. Investigators followed these threads like a trail through a forest, slowly piecing together the origin of what had become a deadly mix. It wasn't just that the medications were present, it was that they could be linked back to a source, a private cabinet allegedly associated with Tommy Lee Jones. The revelation shocked those familiar with the case. Access, proximity, and familial trust all intersected in a way that made the tragedy not just a personal loss, but a matter of potential criminal liability. It's important to pause and consider what this means in practical terms. Prescription medications, especially sedatives, are not commodities you casually acquire. They are controlled, monitored, and regulated precisely because of their potency. For a young woman to have multiple rare sedatives in her system, especially at levels capable of contributing to her death, points to either extraordinary negligence or deliberate access. In either case, the implications for those who had the ability to control the medications are profound. At the same time, the report raised questions about timing, dosage, and intent. Did Victoria ingest the drugs herself in moments of desperation? Were they provided to her unknowingly? Or was there an element of deliberate administration? Medical examiners could speak to what was in her system, but they could not explain why it was there. That gap, the space between knowledge of fact and understanding of motive, is what would drive the next phase of the investigation and eventually capture national attention. The autopsy also illuminated other details that complicated the narrative. Beyond the rare sedatives, traces of other substances were present, each contributing to a physiological state that was delicate and dangerous. Alcohol, common prescription medications, and other compounds interacted unpredictably. It is here that the tragedy becomes almost clinical in its precision. Each substance alone may not have been fatal, but in combination, the result was catastrophic. The complexity of this chemical interplay highlighted the stakes, underscored the risk, and magnified the consequences of access and oversight. For the public, the revelations were almost surreal. How could an icon of cinema, a man whose name evokes authority, control, and professionalism, be connected, even indirectly, to the substances that contributed to his daughter's death? The juxtaposition of Hollywood prestige and personal tragedy created a cognitive dissonance that gripped headlines, social media, and everyday conversation. Questions abounded. Did fame shield him from scrutiny? Could privilege create blind spots in responsibility? And ultimately, could love and tragedy coexist in such a volatile, dangerous mix? Friends and acquaintances of Victoria offered chilling reflections in the wake of the report. Some spoke of subtle warnings, moments when they suspected she was accessing dangerous medications, but couldn't pinpoint the source. Others reflected on her increasing secrecy, her anxiety, and the rapid escalation of risk in her life. The pattern was tragically clear in retrospect. Multiple exposures, repeated ingestion, and a system of access that, intentionally or not, facilitated the combination of substances that would prove fatal. Each recollection added texture, human emotion, and an unsettling resonance to the clinical facts of the autopsy. Legal and medical experts immediately weighed in, explaining the rarity of the sedatives, the risks of polypharmacy, the dangerous combination of multiple medications, and the ways in which controlled substances can end up in unauthorized hands. Their analysis was stark and precise. These were not casual medications. They were potent tools, dangerous in the wrong context, and their presence in Victoria's system was a key piece of evidence for investigators seeking to understand what happened. The connection to Tommy Lee Jones' private cabinet crystallized the narrative. Investigators documented how certain medications were traced back through prescription records, inventory logs, and personal access points. The findings suggested a source that was intimate, trusted, and legally responsible, a private collection maintained under the father's name, which became the focal point for questions of access, oversight, and accountability. For investigators, the cabinet was more than a storage space. It was a potential link between controlled substances and a vulnerable individual who tragically lost her life. Even within the family, reactions were fraught. The combination of grief, suspicion, and media scrutiny created a volatile atmosphere. Family members wrestled with disbelief, anger, and guilt. How could this have happened? Who was responsible? And most hauntingly, could it have been prevented? The autopsy report didn't answer these questions. It provided the facts, the evidence, and the chemical truth, but it also left a yawning gap between knowledge and closure, between investigation and understanding. The public narrative quickly shifted from tragic death to potential scandal. Headlines emphasized the rare sedatives, the connection to Tommy Lee Jones, and the legal implications. Social media and forums debated the nature of parental responsibility, the ethics of access to controlled substances, and the role of fame in amplifying both risk and scrutiny. It was a story that blended personal tragedy, criminal investigation, and celebrity culture in a way that few narratives do, capturing attention and fueling speculation at every turn. For those following the case closely, the autopsy report was both a culmination of years of struggle and the starting point for legal inquiry. The details within it framed every subsequent discussion, investigation, and media narrative. It was a lens through which the events of Victoria's life, her struggles, her substance use, her relationships, could be examined with clinical precision, even as the emotional resonance of loss, grief, and betrayal reverberated beyond the page. And yet, the report left some questions deliberately unresolved. Was there intent? Was access accidental or negligent? Could anyone have intervened effectively? Could her life have been saved with earlier action, stricter oversight, or different choices? These open questions fueled both public fascination and investigative urgency, setting the stage for the unraveling scandal, the legal ramifications, and ultimately, the arrest of Tommy Lee Jones. The moment investigators discovered the rare sedatives in Victoria's system, the next logical step was to trace their origin. This is where the story shifted from tragedy to investigation, from personal loss to public scrutiny. Each pill, each vial, each prescription had a story, a paper trail that could lead directly to its source. And in this case, the trail was both shocking and intimate, leading straight to Tommy Lee Jones' private cabinet. Tracing medications is not as simple as it sounds. Every prescription carries identifiers, batch numbers, prescribing doctor, date filled, and dispensing pharmacy. Investigators meticulously reviewed Victoria's recent prescriptions, cross-referenced her medical records, and examined her communications for any clues about acquisition. What emerged was a pattern that suggested deliberate access, not a one-time mistake, but repeated opportunity for exposure. The cabinet itself became a focal point of inquiry. Described by sources as a locked, well-maintained collection of controlled substances, it was meant to be secure, restricted, and closely monitored. But somehow, medications from that cabinet ended up in Victoria's possession, raising immediate questions about oversight, responsibility, and possible negligence. How could a system designed to protect fail so catastrophically? And more importantly, how long had this access been occurring before anyone noticed? Investigators began interviewing friends, staff, and medical professionals who had been in Victoria's life. They sought to understand not just the mechanics of access, but the context, why she might have turned to these medications, who she trusted, and whether anyone else could have facilitated their distribution. Testimonies painted a picture of a young woman navigating desperation, trust, and secrecy, often in isolation. Each account added layers to the narrative, revealing subtle signs that something was amiss long before the fatal event. Legal experts were quick to weigh in on the implications. Unauthorized access to controlled substances is a serious offense, especially when it leads to harm or death. The fact that the medications could be traced to a cabinet under a parent's name introduced questions of accountability that were both legally and ethically complex. Was it a case of negligence, poor judgment, or something more sinister? And in a world where family loyalty intersects with the law, how do investigators establish intent? The forensic team examined the cabinet for fingerprints, logs, and any indication of access by Victoria or others. Every detail mattered. The order of bottles, the timing of prescriptions, even small residues that could indicate handling. The evidence suggested that access was possible over a period of time, and that Victoria's exposure to these rare sedatives was not an isolated incident. This pattern painted a chilling portrait. Repeated opportunity, repeated exposure, and repeated risk, all converging toward the tragic outcome. But the investigation wasn't just about the physical cabinet. Emails, texts, and communications with pharmacists, doctors, and friends were scrutinized to map the timeline. Investigators wanted to know when Victoria had first accessed the medications, how often, and under what circumstances. They looked for gaps, anomalies, and inconsistencies that could point to negligence or intent. Every discovery deepened the intrigue. The trail wasn't just chemical. It was digital, emotional, and relational, revealing the complex web of trust, secrecy, and family dynamics that defined Victoria's final months. Friends described subtle warning signs in the days before her death, sudden requests for certain medications, furtive behavior, and anxiety that seemed disproportionate to the situation. Medical professionals noted escalating tolerance to substances, increasing risk of overdose, and patterns consistent with repeated exposure to sedatives. Investigators combined these accounts with the autopsy findings, creating a timeline that left little room for doubt about repeated access. The traceability of the drugs was a turning point. Once linked to the cabinet, the investigation shifted focus: access, accountability, and potential legal consequences. How could medications stored securely under a parent's name end up in a vulnerable young adult's possession, who failed to ensure these substances were safeguarded? And, perhaps most importantly, could earlier intervention have prevented the tragic outcome? These questions created tension not just in legal circles, but in public discourse, with media outlets dissecting every detail and social media users debating the morality, negligence, and culpability involved. It became clear that this was more than an unfortunate accident. The intersection of familial access, addictive vulnerability, and rare medications created a scenario in which tragedy was almost inevitable. Investigators emphasized that in cases involving potent sedatives, even a single exposure can be dangerous, and repeated exposure can be lethal. In Victoria's case, the combination of substances, timing, and prior vulnerabilities created a perfect storm. The public was riveted. Headlines highlighted the rare sedatives, the connection to Tommy Lee Jones, and the ethical questions surrounding parental responsibility. Commentators debated whether fame and privilege had played a role in facilitating access or whether it was a series of tragic coincidences. Every new detail seemed to amplify the tension. The private cabinet, the repeated exposure, and the documented history of substance use created a narrative that was impossible to ignore. But even as the media and public speculated, investigators pressed on. They wanted to know exactly how the medications were obtained from the cabinet, whether anyone else had access, and how the timing aligned with Victoria's final days. Every lead, every piece of evidence, every witness testimony was scrutinized for inconsistencies, contradictions, and clues that could reveal the truth. And as the investigation progressed, the focus increasingly narrowed on one person, Tommy Lee Jones. The tracing of the medications marked a critical juncture. It transformed a private tragedy into a public inquiry, a medical puzzle into a legal investigation, and grief into accountability. It was the bridge between the autopsy findings and the eventual arrest, the evidence that suggested not just exposure, but a chain of events linked to family oversight, access, and potentially negligence. And yet, even with the cabinet traced and the medications accounted for, questions remained. Was there intent? Could the tragedy have been prevented? How much responsibility lay with those who maintained control over the medications? And how would the public, the media, and the law interpret the convergence of fame, family, and substance use? The moment the news broke, the reaction was immediate, fierce, and relentless. Social media exploded with disbelief. Fans struggled to reconcile the image of the stoic, gravel-voiced actor with the idea that he could be connected, however indirectly, to the death of his own daughter. Headlines splashed across the internet, each one more sensational than the last. Tommy Lee Jones implicated in daughter's death? Rare drugs found linked to actor's private cabinet. Public curiosity surged, fueled by the combination of celebrity, tragedy, and mystery. People wanted answers, and they wanted them fast. Investigators, meanwhile, were under intense pressure. The autopsy had provided the hard facts. Rare sedatives in Victoria's system, patterns of repeated exposure, and now a traceable source. But the public scrutiny added a new layer of complexity. Every action, every search warrant, every interview was being watched, analyzed, and speculated upon. The investigation became a high-stakes balancing act. Gather evidence methodically while navigating the tidal wave of media attention. Public opinion was polarized. Some defended Tommy Lee Jones, suggesting that there could be no evidence of intent and that the tragedy was an unfortunate accident. Others were less forgiving, questioning how access to such dangerous medications could have been allowed, especially given Victoria's known vulnerabilities. Commentators debated morality, accountability, and the intersection of privilege and tragedy. Each article, post, and thread amplified the tension, creating a national conversation that oscillated between grief and outrage. In the midst of this, law enforcement worked tirelessly to establish a timeline. They traced medication logs, interviewed pharmacists, and cross-referenced hospital records. Every detail mattered. Investigators sought to understand exactly how Victoria had gained access, how long it had been occurring, and whether there was negligence or complicity. The trail led inevitably to Tommy Lee Jones, whose private cabinet had been intended as secure storage but now represented a critical link in the chain of events. Friends and acquaintances of Victoria spoke to reporters, adding human context to the clinical details of the investigation. Some described subtle signs of desperation in her final days, furtive attempts to access medications, anxiety about running out of supplies, and attempts to hide her struggles from family and friends. Others noted her repeated efforts to regain control, her fleeting moments of hope, and the oscillating pattern between recovery attempts and relapse. These personal accounts painted a portrait of a young woman caught in a cycle that was as much emotional and relational as it was chemical. Legal experts weighed in on the potential ramifications. Unauthorized access to controlled substances, especially when it results in harm or death, can carry severe penalties. The link to a private cabinet under the actor's name raised complex questions about parental responsibility, oversight, and accountability. Could negligence be established? Was there evidence of intent? How would the courts interpret the intersection of family trust and legal responsibility? The answers were far from straightforward, but they were essential to understanding the emerging scandal. Meanwhile, the public remained riveted. Every development in the investigation made headlines. The tracing of the drugs, interviews with friends, and commentary from experts in law and medicine. Social media platforms became forums for debate, speculation, and moral judgment. Some users speculated about potential motives, others expressed sympathy for the family, and many wrestled with the broader questions the case raised about fame, access, and responsibility. The story transcended the boundaries of celebrity news, tapping into universal anxieties about trust, protection, and accountability. Investigators also faced the delicate task of separating speculation from evidence. Rumors circulated quickly, fueled by incomplete information, emotional responses, and sensationalized reporting. Law enforcement had to focus on facts, timelines, prescription records, interviews, and physical evidence. Every step forward was carefully documented, ensuring that when the case eventually reached the courts, the narrative could be supported by verified information rather than conjecture. During this period, the media narrative began to take shape. Reporters highlighted the rare sedatives, the private cabinet, and the potential role of Tommy Lee Jones in the tragedy. They explored Victoria's history of substance use and brushes with the law, painting a complex picture that juxtaposed personal vulnerability with access to lethal substances. Analysts debated how the interplay of fame, family dynamics, and privilege might have contributed to the circumstances leading to her death. The combination of human interest and scandal made the story impossible to ignore. Public sentiment, however, was not monolithic. Vigils and tributes for Victoria emerged online, highlighting her struggles, her humanity, and the tragedy of a life cut short. Supporters called for compassion, focusing on addiction as a disease and warning against immediate judgment of her father. Others demanded accountability, arguing that access to controlled substances is a responsibility that cannot be ignored, regardless of family ties or fame. This tension between empathy and condemnation would define much of the discourse surrounding the case. Meanwhile, Within the investigation, every lead, every witness statement, and every piece of evidence was carefully cataloged. Investigators built a comprehensive timeline: Victoria's final days, her interactions with friends and family, the medications she accessed, and the pattern of her substance use. Each element added depth to the emerging narrative, showing not only the mechanics of her exposure, but also the emotional and relational context that shaped her final hours. The interplay between vulnerability and access became increasingly apparent, providing the framework for the legal and ethical questions that would dominate the case. By this point, the public and the press understood that the case was no longer simply about tragedy or celebrity. It had become a complex investigation into family responsibility, access to controlled substances, and the unforeseen consequences of neglect, oversight, or potentially worse. Every revelation, every twist, and every detail heightened tension, leaving audiences desperate to understand the full story and its implications. But just as the narrative seemed to settle into a pattern, new details emerged. The cabinet contained more than just rare sedatives. There were inconsistencies in logs and records, and questions arose about who else might have had access. The situation became increasingly complex, and the possibility of criminal liability loomed ever larger. It was no longer just an investigation. It was a full-blown legal and public reckoning. The morning the news broke, the atmosphere in Hollywood and across the country was electric with shock. Reporters camped outside courthouse steps, social media exploded with theories, and news outlets scrambled to confirm the details. Few could reconcile the image of the legendary actor, calm, commanding, stoic, with the reality that he was now facing legal scrutiny over his daughter's death. Questions buzzed relentlessly. What did he know? When did he know it? Could this have been prevented? And most importantly, what would the courts uncover in the coming weeks and months? The arrest itself was calculated and methodical. Law enforcement officers executed the procedure with precision, mindful of both the high profile of the case and the intense media presence. Tommy Lee Jones was reportedly cooperative, yet the gravity of the moment was palpable. The public, watching through cameras, live streams, and news coverage, could sense the tension. The collision of personal tragedy and public accountability in real time. For many, it was surreal, a household name, an icon of American cinema, now handcuffed in connection to the substances that contributed to his daughter's death. Immediately, legal experts weighed in. The charges, connected to access and alleged negligence involving controlled substances, carried serious consequences. Unauthorized access to prescription sedatives, especially in circumstances that lead to harm, is a grave offense. The potential penalties could include fines, incarceration, and a long-lasting impact on public perception. But beyond the legal ramifications, the arrest also raised moral and ethical questions. What does parental responsibility look like when fame, resources, and private access intersect with vulnerability? Could this have been avoided? And how much culpability lies in negligence versus intent? Public reaction was predictably polarized. Supporters of Jones argued for context and nuance, emphasizing that the tragic outcome was not necessarily a reflection of his intent or character. They highlighted his career, charitable contributions, and previous roles as a responsible parent. Detractors, meanwhile, focused on access and accountability, questioning how medications could have reached Victoria and whether oversight failures constituted criminal negligence. The social media discourse was unrelenting, with forums, threads, and comment sections dissecting every possible angle, fact, and rumor. The arrest also sent shockwaves through Hollywood. Colleagues, collaborators, and fans struggled to process the juxtaposition of personal tragedy with professional reputation. Industry insiders debated what this meant for his legacy, the moral responsibilities of celebrities, and the broader implications for families navigating fame, privacy, and risk. Conversations moved beyond the specifics of Victoria's death, touching on universal questions about privilege, accountability, and the unforeseen consequences of access. Inside the investigation, law enforcement meticulously prepared for the legal process. They compiled timelines, cross-referenced evidence from the autopsy, traced the medications, and documented access logs from the private cabinet. Each detail strengthened the case, highlighting repeated exposure, potential negligence, and the alignment between available medications and the substances found in Victoria's system. Investigators had to anticipate defense strategies, address potential legal loopholes, and ensure that every piece of evidence could withstand rigorous scrutiny in court. Meanwhile, the public watched, consumed with a mix of fascination and disbelief. Every detail of the arrest, from mugshots to courtroom procedures, was dissected in real time. News outlets published deep dives, investigative podcasts explored possible motives, and social media became a theater of speculation. For many, the story had evolved from personal tragedy into a cultural phenomenon, a cautionary tale about access, responsibility, and the hidden dangers that can lurk even in households of fame and wealth. Family dynamics during this period were fraught with tension and grief. The arrest intensified emotions as loved ones navigated sorrow for Victoria, concern for Tommy Lee Jones, and the invasive attention of the media. Statements issued by family representatives sought to balance privacy with the unavoidable public spotlight, emphasizing grief while acknowledging the seriousness of the legal proceedings. Interviews with close friends revealed profound heartbreak, frustration, and disbelief at how the tragedy had escalated into a legal and media storm. In the courtroom, the tension was palpable. The case was a complex weave of autopsy findings, medication tracing, family testimony, and expert analysis. Prosecutors focused on access and oversight, highlighting the repeated exposure to rare sedatives and the alignment with medications traced to Jones' private cabinet. Defense attorneys countered with arguments about intent, the limitations of parental control, and the unpredictable trajectory of Victoria's personal choices. Each exchange added layers of drama, illustrating the challenge of reconciling legal principles with deeply human tragedy. The arrest also marked a pivotal shift in public perception. What had initially been viewed as an isolated family tragedy now became a matter of national attention, sparking debates about parental accountability, the ethics of celebrity privilege, and the dangers of accessible medications in vulnerable households. The narrative was